Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I'm joined once again by my dude Brandon DaCruz for part two of the body recomposition for women series. So last week we really dug into body recomp as a whole, biggest factors that determine it, types of body recomposition, all the physiological advantages females have that might make body recomposition easier for them than men. And then a lot of real world coaching experience and mistakes we see women making that are holding them back from achieving the body recomposition that, again, based on the rest of the episode, women should be more capable of achieving than most men. So wanted to wrap up this series today digging into programming and nutrition implications. So I'm excited to get into it. Brandon, before we dig into it, anything else you want to add, or are you ready to hop right in?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I appreciate you having me back on and being able to extend and expand upon the last one. I am appreciative. I got a lot of good feedback, especially from the female audience on the nuances and the fact that we delivered on a lot of context for this episode. This is something that I don't believe has been explored enough within our sector or our area of the fitness, nutrition, and training space. So I hope that this is incredibly useful and just even if it's not something that you're in the place or in the state to pursue right now. I just want to be able to inspire some critical thinking. And I did have a couple coaches that reached out to me, including someone that I coached myself and used to work for you yourself, Chelsea. So shout out to Chelsea, that it just
Shout
opened
out.
up her mind to the possibility of things she may have been seeing and just overlooking, or a phase or a goal that she can pursue with other clients. So just want to always deliver value. So I'm looking forward to this part two, especially because this is really our wheelhouse, my friend. Getting into, I always say my goal is to bridge the gap between research, information, and practical application. So this is where the coaching experience comes into play. So I'm looking forward to getting into this.
Yeah, man. Really cool conversation because a lot of this isn't an angle that I've ever heard it approached from before. So it's cool to actually be able to dig into that and kind of like broach some new subjects and topics here. So if you haven't already listened to part one, highly recommend, as again, all of what we're about to discuss will make so much more sense. But let's get into some application here. So, knowing everything we discussed in part one, all of the advantages women may have over men in terms of their ability to recomp, does it change how long you would keep a female client at maintenance or a slight deficit attempting to recomp versus a male client?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really where the coaching experience and application side really starts to matter, because while the principles of recomposition don't fundamentally change between males and females, I do believe that the execution and the timeline often does. And in practice, I will often keep female clients in a recomposition setup or recomposition phase, whether that's at maintenance or in a slight deficit, for longer than I do or I would with a male client. So what I find is that many women tend to respond well to longer recomp phases. So I'll often run these in my own practice for 16 to 24 weeks at a time. And based on all the physiological and practical differences between males and females, women tend to be in a position where they can build muscle while simultaneously losing body fat at or slightly below maintenance. And because of that, they can often continue making significant physique progress without needing to aggressively push into a deeper deficit. And that is something I often have to convince clients not to do. And really, what I'm trying to do is save them from themselves and show them a different way, which is often enlightening from, I guess, a practical application perspective, but it's also really helpful from a mental perspective. So one of the biggest things that I found advantageous is, instead of rushing into a fat loss phase, I'll often hold my female clients at maintenance or in a very slight deficit, and I'll allow recomposition to take place and run its course. And that not only helps them enhance their physique in the moment, like in the phase itself, but often it allows them in the future not to always default to dieting. That's something that I always say that word to women. I'm like, you have a default for dieting, meaning every time that you feel a little uncomfortable, or that you're in a building phase and you feel like you're getting a little bit puffy, or you feel like you're not like ripped and lean, or you don't have resting abs at all times, you default to dieting. And that's something I really try to get people out of the habit of doing. Now, another reason that I do this is because the downside of pushing an aggressive deficit is often higher in female clients, especially from a hormonal and reproductive standpoint. So from a coaching perspective, it often makes more sense to stay in a productive middle ground longer than, rather than trying to rush into an aggressive phase that compromises their performance and recovery. So something I've seen over and over again is that when I have a female client spend more time at maintenance or in that slight deficit. So why I'm alluding to that is because it's going to be one of the two. Generally, I'll start women out at maintenance, and then as we get deeper into the phase, I'll transition to a slight deficit. Now, this could actually vary based on where that person is coming from. If I have a slightly leaner female, then I may, you know, um, reverse that and keep them more in maintenance. And then if I have someone with excess adiposity, I will generally err towards the slight deficit. But in either case, it isn't a severe state of like low energy availability. It isn't a massive deficit where it's going to compromise things. And really what I'm trying to do is to focus heavily on dialing in their approach to nutrition and driving up training performance, because then they end up building more muscle, they're improving metabolic health, and they become more responsive to future fat loss phases. So when we do decide to get a little bit more aggressive or get more assertive later on, we achieve better fat loss outcomes with less muscle loss, and they have a better overall physique because they have much more muscle on their frame than they did prior to the recomp phase. Or really, I do this during a primer phase. And so they look better than they would have had we just jumped into a fat loss phase off the bat. So oftentimes, this is an educational moment for me. A lot of women will come to me, and Jeremiah, I'm sure you can relate to this, and they will want to jump right into fat loss. And oftentimes I convince them otherwise. I do a primer phase and I'm trying to get them into a better state physiologically. But within that, the context of that primer phase, they're often achieving body recomposition. So that kind of reinforces to them that, jumping right into an aggressive deficit or an aggressive cut isn't always the way. Maybe it's something they've done previously, but it doesn't have to be the way that they move forward.
Okay. So say we're working with a client who's has a slightly higher body fat, so we're in a slight deficit in this recomp. Do you find typically, I know you said it sounds like typically like 16 to 24 week timeframes on average are a pretty good time frame for this recomp. After that point, are you typically finding, okay, and then we decide we need to actually just push into fat loss to kind of get the job done with, or hey, maybe we're better off now transitioning back to like maintenance and then going to a true fat loss phase? Does that question make sense? Just kind of the periodization of all of that.
It does. And I think that there's so much context to take into consideration. So you're saying, do we need a break in between a recomp phase, or can we go right into fat loss? So really, when I take the primer phase approach, and I say it's a 16-week, that's often what I will utilize, a 16-week phase. And we're really pushing more of the lean building type of, or lean building focused recomp. We're really trying to increase lean mass, either maintain fat mass or decrease fat mass slightly. They're going to be in a more advantageous position to go right into fat loss after. So I use that, what I will term that, so my clients that are listening to this will know this, is a pre-fat loss primer phase. Now, if they are someone that we really push more the fat loss end of the recomposition process, then we can take a break and really rest at maintenance. But it often comes down to doing another needs analysis. So whenever anyone comes to me, they go through a comprehensive client intake process. And in that client intake process, I do a needs analysis where I do a real reevaluation and a reassessment at the end of every phase. We discuss their goals. We discuss feedback from that phase, what things they liked, what things they didn't like. I also do a full review of say it was 16 weeks, the 16 weeks, and where they're at from a physiological perspective. And then also a lot of times what I'm doing, and I do this quite often within the first phase that I work with someone, is I get a comprehensive set of labs. So I'm not only looking at a CMP and a CBC, but I'm also looking at a comprehensive profile of their sex hormones, their thyroid hormones. So then I have to see, are there any bottlenecks? Are there any things or gaps that we need to address? Is this person erring towards hypothyroidism? Or do their labs look beautiful and they're in a place physiologically where we can push into fat loss? So there's many things that we have to consider, especially when we think about female physiology. We also have to think about the menstrual cycle and the health of that menstrual cycle. If someone is recomping, they've gotten significantly leaner, but they're starting to have a delay or disruption in their menstrual cycle, fat loss is not the way forward. We need to restore. We need to get them back to maintenance or a little bit above. We need to completely restore energy availability and then go on from there. And in those cases, I find that actually transitioning them into a building phase where we're focusing more on muscle growth and fueling for the work required is more advantageous. So it's really going to depend on where that person is. And it's going to be a comprehensive process that goes between coach and client, discussing their goals, also their needs, and then also where are you at from a physiological state.
Okay, absolutely. And I think this kind of ties in very well when we're talking about this phasic approach as a whole, which you already kind of alluded to this, but where would you say this recomp process tends to show up the most? Is it typically, hey, like again, this is more at the start of the process, right alongside the primer phase? Or can this be something that's happening like multiple times within your work with a client?
Yeah, so this is
Like
a great
multiple
question.
recomp phases? Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a great question. And the answer is it can happen both. So recomposition most commonly shows up early in the client journey. but it's absolutely something that can occur multiple times across different phases, especially when the right conditions are in place and programming is dialed in an intelligent and then also periodized manner. I'm big, I know you term it a phasic approach. I'm big into something similar, which is nutritional periodization. So what I'm really trying to do with every single phase that I take a client through is to allow each phase to flow into one another, transition properly, and to potentiate each other. And so instead of thinking of recomp as a one-time phase, I look at it as something that we can achieve whenever someone's physiology, their training, and their nutrition align correctly. Now, the most common place I see recomposition is in the first phase that I'm working with a client, especially if I start them out with my primer phase. So this is especially true for clients who are newer to coaching. They're coming from inconsistent or suboptimal training. And although that may sound like some people are just going to like let that bypass, Jeremiah, we both know that most people that come to us from a coaching perspective, including fitness professionals themselves, they are not training in an optimized manner. So that could be from an execution perspective. I see it especially commonly from an intensity perspective. And so these are people that have a better predisposition towards recomp if we're really able to dial in their training and kind of divorce themselves. A lot of people are attached to their training. If you could divorce themselves from the process and really give them a more objective path forward, I find that to be advantageous. Now, another position is I have a lot of women that come to me that are underfueled or dieting chronically, or there's people that are lacking structure in their nutrition. And in all of those cases, I'm working to optimize things across the board and to improve the training stimulus, their nutrition and lifestyle as a whole, to create the perfect environment for building muscle and losing body fat. Now, I will often take clients through primer phases to elicit body recomposition when they first come to me. So in most cases, especially with women, the first phase I'm going to take them through is a primer phase. And these days, a lot of coaches use the term primer phase, but my primer phase differs as I find that a lot of coaching programs, they'll use like a quick 3 to 4 week primer. Now, in my case, I run a more projected or extended primer phase. And a lot of times it's a minimum of 12 weeks, but the majority goes 16 weeks. And if someone's really in this good groove, I'll run it 24 weeks. Like there is no set time limit. I just have not found an advantage to doing, at least in the manner that I do it, very short primer phases with people. But by the end of these phases, clients look leaner, they're performing better, and they've built lean muscle. And this is something I have dozens of examples of on my Instagram, as I've documented the process a ton of times. Now, recomp can also occur during a well-executed fat loss phase. And this is another example of where I've seen it a lot in practice, especially with women. So if the deficit we've used is moderate, protein intake is high, training is structured, and the client is in a responsive state to start the phase, they can definitely lose fat while maintaining or even gaining small amounts of muscle. Now, the one thing I do have to acknowledge here is that recomp during a fat loss phase is usually less dramatic than during a primer phase. And that is because we have to take into consideration that during a fat loss phase, there's more of an emphasis on fat loss, which is going to somewhat bottleneck the lean muscle growth process. Whereas if you're really focusing on body recomp and you're kind of going more for like a lean mass accretion or like an equal balance between some fat loss and some lean mass gain, you're going to see a more dramatic recomp effect. But in either case, if you're in a fat loss phase, you're maintaining all your metabolically active tissue or even gaining just slightly a little bit, it is improving your lean mass to fat mass ratio. So you're still recomping. And this is still going to contribute to better physique outcomes and better muscle retention. So at the end of the day, recomp occurs when your training stimulus is increased and really dialed in, your recovery is supported, your nutrition is aligned, and the individual is responsive and adherent. So really when I think about this question conceptually, this is something like I cover recomp like when I do private one-on-one mentorships. And a lot of times clients, or other coaches essentially want to ask me is kind of like a black and white question. Can recomp only happen in a recomp phase? And I don't seem that to be the case because there's multiple forms of recomp as we covered in our last episode. But I really think of recomp more as not like what phase are we in, but are the conditions right to put this person in a position to recomp? So this is why I believe, and I've seen it in my own coaching practice, that this is not a one-time thing. It's not like you can only have this occur once. This can happen multiple times depending on the person, depending on their physiology, their body composition. We also have to take into consideration other things that change across the life course. So for instance, if someone gets really busy or has a promotion at work or has children, there may be a period of detraining. So then they're going to be in a better position, as we had covered in our last episode, that is one of the factors that influence your ability to recomp. Or say that someone takes off from coaching, or they just fall off their diet for an extended period of time, they regain weight and the predominance of that weight is fat. They're going to be more likely to be able to recomp when they come back. So there's many factors and things to take into consideration, but it's really not about what phase are we in. It's really are the conditions right for me to take this person through a phase where we're focusing on achieving simultaneous fat loss and lean mass gain?
Okay. Okay. So another question that kind of brings to mind for me then, looking at the other end of the spectrum with a more advanced client, then given women are more capable of recomp than men, does that change how you would approach for a more advanced client, like a building phase? Meaning, like, would you be less likely to take a more advanced female into a building phase where, hey, we're okay with you accruing some fat tissue and pushing weight up a little bit more aggressively, like we might with like a more advanced male, given the ability to potentially recomp easier? Does that make sense? Like it's like again, like hey, we're in a more advanced building phase with a male client. We know we'll probably have to get kind of gain some need to gain a little bit of body fat to push up tissue at the same time. Maybe not as true for women.
Yeah, I see this a little bit differently. Like when you bring that up, I actually think about metabolic phenotypes, and just for the audience, Jeremy, I know that we've discussed this privately before. Metabolic phenotype refers to how your metabolism upregulates or downregulates in response to changes in energy availability or technically calorie intake. And with that, we have spendthrift metabolic phenotypes, which means they increase energy expenditure precipitously when in a surplus, and they don't downregulate energy expenditure as much during a deficit. And I believe you refer to that as an adaptive metabolism. Remember those concepts that we used to discuss?
Yeah.
Okay, so just so the audience can refer back to something. Then we have the thrifty metabolic phenotype. And thrifty metabolic phenotypes, essentially, they do not see large increases in energy expenditure. In response, they don't see a positive metabolic adaptation to increases in calorie intake. But when they go into a deficit, they tend to downregulate energy expenditure more precipitously or more quickly. And that causes a little bit more friction from a fat loss perspective. Now, it's difficult to really disentangle this, but I did a massive podcast on these concepts many years ago. And with much of the literature I saw, women were more predisposed towards being that thrifty metabolic phenotype. And one thing that reinforces that is an overfeeding study by James Levine, where they took individuals and they put them into an 8-week study where they overfed them by 1,000 calories per day. And the average person increased energy expenditure just by the NEAT component. So their non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so just moving spontaneously, by, I believe, 328 calories per day. However, and there was even a male that increased by 700 calories per day. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean that they just burn 328 calories. So if you were to increase your energy intake by 1,000 calories, you would technically increase the thermic effect of feeding by 100 calories because thermic effect of feeding generally accounts for 10%. So then we have this 328 calorie bump in NEAT. We have a 100 calorie bump in thermic effect of eating. And generally with resting metabolic rate, we could see anywhere between a 5 to 15% increase with that massive of a increase in calorie intake. So a lot of people swallowed up a lot of those calories essentially. So they didn't gain what they expected. So if it was 1,000 calories over 8 weeks, if you just back calculate that, you would estimate that they would gain 16 pounds. However, there was only two people that downregulated energy expenditure in response to those 1,000 calories, and they were both females. And that's really the only literature that we have that shows that, like what happens to women in energy excess. So that's always kind of informs my practice. I've also seen things of practice, especially when women get to like perimenopause and beyond, that they're more likely to gain fat in a surplus. And it's not about like fearing fat gain. I don't want to get that idea across, but it is that after a certain point, especially in the life course, many women will struggle with fat loss. So I think it would be disadvantageous to put them in a position where we're pushing a surplus that could predispose them towards precipitous fat gain. So what I do with a lot of my women, I take them through a lean building phase. And it's a very small calculated surplus where it's just enough to cover the energetic costs of their training, the increase in some positive metabolic adaptation. So we know that the energy cost of protein synthesis increases once you're in a state of positive energy balance. So I'm really just trying to keep them in a well-fueled state, but it's at a very slow and steady rate of gain. And when we're talking advanced individuals, so if we're talking advanced females, I'm really going to only be shooting for at most 1% body weight gain per month. And that would be at most. Most
Slower
times it's
than you
0.5.
normally would.
Yes. And that's just due to the fact that I just see it more in both sides. So physiologically, women will tend to store fat easier, and it'll be harder for them to lose fat. They also suffer with more negative downstream ramifications and metabolic adaptations, and they really suffer from perturbations in energy availability, especially from a hormonal and reproductive standpoint when going into a deficit. So say, for instance, we have two individuals. We have a male and we have a female. We both push their weight up quite aggressively in the hopes of gaining muscle, which honestly, at this point, if we actually look into the literature, we do not need a massive surplus to gain muscle because it actually only predisposes you towards more fat. So if we look at most of the trials that look at large surplus versus small surplus, we actually see up to 5 times more fat gain for very similar increases in fat-free mass or lean mass. So I think it would be disadvantageous to push women in that capacity because it would predispose them towards fat gain, which physiologically isn't great for them, metabolically isn't great for them, but also psychologically, a lot of women have had poor experiences with building phases. And I can't tell you from a practitioner or coaching side how many women have been scared and have had such poor and like traumatic experiences working with other coaches that push their weight up, whether that be, quote unquote, they were reverse dieting, but they gained 20 pounds, or they pushed them into, essentially a building phase that was really a bulk, and they never want to go back to their process. So they automatically associate muscle gain or building phases with, hey, I'm getting bulky, and that they're not one and the same. Really, in terms of a lean building phase, I'm really trying to drive the training stimulus. That's the main focus. And I just want to cover the energetic cost of that so that you have sufficient resources on board to push your training performance, which is going to be the most important vector for increasing lean mass accretion. But I will say that I am more conservative with the lean building phases that I approach women, I do with women. And if I have a woman that is in perimenopause or especially in the postmenopausal transition, I am even more calculated and conservative with the type of surpluses, or even if I do bring them into a surplus, because I don't think that it's advantageous or necessary.
Okay. I definitely could have framed that question better, which you ended up answering it regardless. Essentially, do you think that a slight surplus is less advantageous for a female versus a male when it comes to optimizing our ability to build? But it sounds like we approach things very, very similarly there. I'll find the same in that, again, just a very slight surplus or even like upper end of maintenance is typically what I'm aiming for. Where I do still find with like some male clients who are a bit more advanced, just anecdotally, I'm not pushing anyone to gain body fat, but like the scale is more important to me. Like it does seem like, hey, dude, we do need to see these numbers ticking up a little bit more consistently for you to consistently be making more progress. And we'll be able to tease out like it's just if we're just gaining body fat, like I'm not pushing you for that. But I do find that like that number increasing seems to be a bit more important for like that specific demographic in males continuing to progress in the building phase versus women.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I can completely relate to that, and I take a similar approach. One thing that I do or differently between sexes is with men, I actually have a target rate of gain that I'm looking for. So usually it's 0.25% of body weight per week, which is going to come out to 1%. I don't even tell women that. Like I told you that because that's what I'm thinking about in a coaching context on the back end when I'm looking at their data. I don't have any type of rate of gain targets for women. I think that creates a negative connotation in their mind. If you remember years ago, when we did like a building phase series essentially. And I kept honing in on the fact that I call it a lean building phase rather than a bulking phase. And at that time, there was many different phases. So people were calling them massing phases or gaining phases. I never used that vernacular or that language because then I started working more with women, like predominantly, and that's what I am right now. And I just find that there's a negative connotation to that. I don't want them shooting for that. Many women have an unfortunate and an unhealthy relationship with the scale. So that's really not what I'm focusing on. I'm really trying to get them to drive body composition progress through their training and to stop focusing on their body weight, whether that be the actual scale weight itself or a body weight target. And rather, instead of focusing on how much your body weighs, I want you to focus on what your body can do in the gym. And that's really where we turn it from maybe a scale weight focused type of perspective to a physique and performance focused perspective.
Very much. Is training feeling good? Is training progressing? Is our biofeedback in a good place? Typically, we're probably making progress then. Our visuals in a good place as well. Okay, so let's get it back on track here. My bad there. With the physiological advantages we talked about in the last episode, will the way you approach recomposition nutrition for women differ than how you'd approach it for men? So when we're talking things like macros, nutrient timing, would that be any different?
So broadly speaking, the principles don't change. Energy balance is still going to matter. Protein is still going to be a priority, and progressive overload still needs to be in place to maximize physique progress. But where things do differ is in the degree, the precision, and then also the priorities within those principles. And that's really where like the nuance of coaching comes in. And I use my experience having worked with hundreds of women over the past 16 years to ensure I'm putting them in the best position to succeed. So my first focus is on their total energy intake. And from a calorie intake perspective, I'm typically more conservative with the energy deficit I use with female clients than I am with males. And that actually goes on both spectrums. So we just went off on a tangent about lean building phases. I'm more conservative with the calorie surplus that I use with women, but I'm also on the opposite end of the spectrum, more conservative with the size of the deficit that I use with women, due to the fact that women tend to be more sensitive to large perturbations in energy availability, which means when you take them from a specific calorie intake and you lower it drastically, there's more downstream ramifications, especially from a hormonal axis perspective and then a reproductive standpoint for women than for men. So instead of pushing aggressive calorie cuts, I'm more likely to keep them at maintenance or in a slight deficit. And this is because if energy availability drops too low, we start to see things like decreased training performance, which is going to hinder body recomposition, or especially from the lean mass building perspective. We're going to see impaired recovery capacity and then hormonal disruption, which all work against recomposition. So I set their nutrition up to support training and recovery and to create just enough of a deficit to drive fat loss, but without compromising muscle or performance. Then next up is protein. And honestly, protein targets don't drastically differ between men and women when scaled to body weight. But what I do emphasize more with female clients, and I think this is more of a practical thing that I do, is I'm really focusing more on the consistency of protein intake and distribution across the day. As I find personally that many women tend to only eat protein a couple times a day, and then they rely on like carb and fat heavy snacks without a sufficient protein source or bolus of protein in there. So instead of having them do like one or two protein heavy meals, because I often find when I do my client intake process and I go over their food diary, a lot of times there's a lot of like macro hoarding, or they're kind of shifting their calories, especially towards the evening. And it's like they have a massive protein meal before bed, but like the rest of the day, it's insufficient, especially from like a muscle protein synthesis stimulating perspective. What I try to do is I'm building out nutrition plans where their intake is distributed over 3 to 5 even servings and where they're hitting a sufficient protein threshold per meal, because that's going to support muscle protein synthesis elevations, recovery, and satiety and adherence, which are all critical for recomposition. Now, carbs and carb timing is where I really place a heavy emphasis with women. A lot of women I find undereat carbohydrates or avoid them altogether, which ends up hurting their training performance, their recovery capacity, their overall output, especially in the gym or even in cardio, and then their hormonal production, especially from a thyroid health perspective. Because we have to realize that carbohydrates play a very important role, especially due to the secretion of insulin in thyroid production, and then also the conversion of T4 to metabolically active T3, which is the actual thyroid hormone that exerts its action on cells and allows us to run a resting metabolic rate. It allows us to play a role in fat oxidation and even muscle protein synthesis. T3 docks into cell receptors and helps with that process. So for recomposition, I'm very intentional about ensuring adequate carbohydrate intake and placing carbs around training to keep my clients well fueled. So I want carbs pre and post workout, because if performance drops significantly over an extended period of time, the stimulus for muscle retention or growth is going to drop. So carbs become a performance lever and not something we unnecessarily restrict. And this is something I also find helps the women I work with, both physically from a performance standpoint, but also mentally, as they start to embrace carbs and the benefits they can derive from them instead of fearing them like they have in the past. Then with fats, I'm ensuring adequate intake to support hormonal health and vitamin absorption, but I'm not pushing them so high that they displace carbohydrates or limit total calorie control. Because keep in mind, a lot of times when it comes to, a lot of people are looking at fats from like a health perspective. They're like, oh, I have my healthy fats, but they're eating tons of avocado or fatty meats, and they're actually over consuming calories. And a lot of times those are the individuals that say, I feel like I'm doing everything right, but nothing's working. I'm not losing fat. I'm not seeing body composition progress. And it's a little bit too much of a good thing, essentially. So we have to be calculated in how we design diets. Now, another area I think is more important for recomposition than most think is nutrient timing and really like the composition of those nutrients, especially how we fuel around the resistance training window. So I'm paying attention to pre-workout fueling, post-workout fueling, and with women, I'm making sure that they're not going back to their old habits. And what I mean by that is I don't want them training fasted for resistance training, and I don't want them going into sessions under-fueled, because performance is going to be a key driver of recomposition. And then last but not least, I build out programs from a nutritional perspective that emphasize a diet built on whole nutrient-dense foods so that all their macronutrient and micronutrient needs are met. I'm looking to maintain a consistent meal structure and predictable eating patterns, meaning we're not doing this macro Tetris type of thing. We're not doing macro hoarding where we're constantly shifting our meals and eating on an erratic schedule and eating 3 meals one day and 6 meals the next day. I really want to get them into a place where their schedule from an eating perspective is dialed in, it's consistent, and it's structured, because that's what's going to support satiety. It's going to support recovery, micronutrient intake, and then most importantly, adherence to the program as a whole. And these are all foundational to sustaining a recomposition phase long enough to actually see the results we're looking for. None of these in isolation are going to drive recomp by itself if it's only, consistently adhered to a week or a few weeks. It's going to have to be a continuous process. So when we dial in all these vectors from a nutritional perspective, it's going to put a client in the most advantageous position to actually lose body fat while gaining lean mass.
Absolutely. The peri-workout fueling, the pre-workout fueling especially, I find is such a neglected aspect of recomp that is so underrated. A lot in the industry kind of downplay the importance of it, but truly, like, I find for so many individuals to make such a big difference. Just getting you hydrated, having some food in our system prior to our training. Our training quality is so much better, and we talked so much about the importance of our training in order for building muscle, which again is such a huge part of recomp, or whatever we can do to better support that will lead to better recomp. And then, as you said as well, I think very underrated, the aspect of just having structure to your day, like having consistency with your meal timings and number of meals. Just if that's all over the place, if your schedule's all over the place, and again, it just is like chaotic from day to day, it is very rare someone who's kind of day to day looks like that is making great progress.
100%.
Okay, so from the training and cardio perspective, then, any major ways you would approach that differently for women versus men?
Yeah, so training and cardio needs to be programmed very intentionally to maximize recomposition outcomes in general. So this is both for males and women or females. But I really believe that so many women have yet to achieve body recomposition because many are not following structured programs that were built for them. I'm not talking about group training programs. I'm not talking about some generic cookie cutter thing that you found online. I really find that a lot of people aren't getting the results that they're looking for because they're trying an approach that was not made or designed for their physiology or their current state in life. So the current chapter that they're in. So first and foremost, my first priority is dialing in resistance training, as this is going to be the main driver of muscle growth. And for female clients, I'm typically programming moderate to moderately high training volumes with a strong emphasis on progressive overload. I'm very big into focusing on getting stronger over time. And that is important for both males and females. However, I think that I'm just going to say this from a coaching perspective, having coached hundreds of both men and women. Men kind of naturally fall in that direction where we always want to be stronger. We're constantly trying to go for maxes. Think about, when we first got into training, I started training 20 years ago and I'm in high school. And so the goal was to hit a 1 repetition max bench. I'm not saying that that's conducive,
of course, yeah.
But I feel like women don't come from that type of background. And so a lot of times they're not used to shooting for higher weights and they're a little bit timid or maybe a little bit intimidated in the gym to fail in the gym or to push harder. So I really try to focus on progressive overload. And then I'm also trying to use full ranges of motion to maximize the mechanical tension stimulus on the target muscle groups. I'm really big into deep full range of motion squats, making sure they're going through a full contractile range, and really focusing on that, especially in like the form reviews that I do in terms of video analysis. And this is because they can, I combine both that moderate to moderately high training volumes and then the progressive overload because women can often tolerate more volume and recover well and benefit from it. So we're using that to accumulate more quality work and drive muscle growth over time. Now, because of that recovery capacity, I'll often use slightly higher training frequencies. So instead of hitting a muscle group once per week, I will often titrate up the training frequency to hit all the muscle groups that will make the largest visual difference to your physique at least 2 to 3 times a week. And I'm a big fan of training frequency. I really like to utilize that as a tool. So it's not that training frequency in and of itself drives muscle gain. It's more so it allows us, it's a lever that we can pull to distribute their total training volume more effectively, to maintain a higher training quality per session so that they're not getting into ranges where they're so fatigued towards the end of a session that they're either not performing an exercise properly, they're not really getting a great stimulus per set. Really what I want to try to do is try to maintain the highest quality stimulus per muscle per session. And then it's also giving us the ability to create a more frequent growth stimulus without tanking their recovery capacity. Then when it comes to training intensity, I want each session completed with high quality effort and all sets taken close to failure. I personally find that many women have never truly trained to failure, and it's not that every session needs to go there, but I'm often looking to help them find that next gear, as I know it'll benefit them not only in this phase from like a recomposition perspective, but for the rest of their training career. So I can't tell you how many videos I've went through with clientele, especially females, and I've had to tell them, hey, you have 3 to 5 reps in the tank. and continually go over and over with them. And this is not from a judgmental perspective. It's not that
Yeah.
they don't work hard. It's that they have almost a self limiter. It's almost like a central governor on what their capabilities and what their capacity is. And I'm trying to break through that. And oftentimes they don't like it at first. I'm gonna be completely honest. Sometimes they feel like I'm challenging them, or I'm unnecessarily pushing them. But when they're able to break through that and they really see how capable, how strong, and how much their performance can increase. One always sticks in the mind. I had a woman that I worked with for quite a long time, and she's actually on maternity leave right now. But I worked with her for years, and she had sent me a top set multiple weeks, and it was a hack squat, and she was getting like 13 to 14 reps, and this was a back off set, taking the failure, and in my mind, I was not seeing, I kept reviewing the tape. I even looked at the timing and stuff. I wasn't seeing a significant loss in velocity. So I wasn't seeing rep speed slow significantly enough to know that she was at failure. So I thought she had 3 to 5 reps in the tank. Well, eventually through the process of working together, she ended up getting a full set where she took it to the fucking house. She got 19 reps. So what she thought was 13 or 14 at failure, she really had 5 reps in the tank. Now, that might sound like a brutal experience. And in the moment it was, but the elation and the pride that she felt of knowing that she had that next gear was something that is going to impact her the rest of her training career. And she continually used to reference that in many of our conversations or our check-ins. Like, she knew she had more. And that's an internal mantra I use with a lot of my clients. I say, you got more. And that's something I tell them to tell themselves. And so these are all things that we have to take into consideration. I do push people very hard, and that's how I get the outcomes that I get. Now, when it comes to, so we have training, and now we also have to look at cardio, because this is something that I'm very intentional with. Most of the female clients I have come in doing too much cardio, especially way too much high intensity cardio. And it's basically to the point where it's being abused. And that's becoming even more and more prominent. Like, say 10 years ago, HIIT cardio was the rave. And then it went out of favor because we realized that the literature wasn't reinforcing that it led to better fat loss outcomes, and it was leading to more fatigue and a bigger recovery cost. Well, now we have certain people in this space that misconstrue research and use citations that don't reinforce what they're claiming. And it's all about, HIIT training or sit training, sprint interval training for women. And they're using their essentially a power of authority to influence women to do this. And I can't tell you how many women come to me in the intake process where they're injured or they're literally trashed, and they haven't seen body recomposition or body composition progress because most of their efforts are put on this sprint interval training or this HIIT interval training, and they're getting injuries, they're getting nagging aches and pulls and joint issues. And so really what I try to do is I try to get them to shift to using cardio as a tool rather than something that they're relying on, whether that be for fat loss or body composition progress. And also I try to get their mindset out of a kind of like this negative framing that they have, because they almost look at some of these sessions as like punishment, and it's just a really negative headspace to be in. So when it comes to cardio for body recomposition, I'm often going to do things like low to moderate intensity cardio that's going to be steady state, and then I really focus on step count targets to increase their state of energy flux, which is something we've discussed quite extensively. We did a 2-part podcast a few years ago on that. But the main thing here is we're not relying on cardio as the primary driver as fat loss during a recomp, because that's what our nutrition is for. And then one thing I pay very close attention to with my female clients that ties into the cardio thing is total systemic stress. So that's going to include their total training volume, their cardio intensity and their duration, their lifestyle stress and their sleep. Because even if they can handle more volume in theory, if life stress is high, if recovery is compromised, we need to adjust. So these are things that I always take into consideration. It's an amalgamation of things. It's dialing in the nutrition. It's really placing a massively heavy emphasis on the resistance training from a proper programming perspective, a progression perspective, and then an execution perspective. And then actually kind of getting them to undo some of the negative and maladaptive habits that they've had with cardio, especially from an intensity perspective, where they really look at that as like the end all be all. And a lot of times it's just explaining to them, listen, this is something that can be a tool and it can help, but the way in which you've been approaching it, especially from the frequency of high intensity cardio, is actually a hindrance to what you're looking to achieve.
Absolutely. It is pretty wild how many clients I've had start where, man, between our resistance training sessions and then like all the classes, like the cardio classes, the like hot yoga classes, the like sculpt classes that still involve weights that we're doing, it's like you're doing like 12 to 14 sessions a week right now. Like our recovery, even if none of these are like, wow, we're taking whatever your quads to all out failure, we're still running into like a big recovery issue here just with the total amount that we're doing. And again, especially we're leaning into a lot more like hit style work as well. I think it can oftentimes be one of the hardest things as well to pull someone back from because it feels like, dude, I'm already doing so much. If I pull back, I want to get worse results. And that's where, again, like the more isn't better.
Mhm.
We need to make sure we can actually recover, like applying a better stimulus to the way we're training and actually being able to recover from that will yield such better shifts in our body composition. But I think that's a huge piece a lot of people are missing.
100%. And I think another thing, yeah, I encounter that quite frequently where someone is doing excessive amounts of exercise from the group classes to the hit interval sessions to the track work to the resistance training as well. And then the bar classes and things of that sort. And oftentimes what I have to do is take a step back with them and help them take a step back. And I do it from an objective perspective as a second pair of eyes. And I say, listen, you came to me with very specific goals, but also with certain bottlenecks, because that's a big part of my client intake process, trying to discover the bottlenecks that are holding this person back from achieving what they want to achieve. And oftentimes, these women feel like they're doing it all. And in terms of an effort and time devotement and commitment perspective, they're putting in a ton of work. So I'm not discounting that whatsoever. But they're putting in a lot of work doing the wrong things and they're not getting a return on their investment. So often what I try to explain to them is, listen, for this period of time, let's take a step back and really focus on the things that are going to move the needle the most. Now that may be 4 to 5 resistance training sessions per week, 3 cardio sessions per week, daily walks. That sounds like you're not doing enough. But in reality, if you can pour all of your effort and all of your energy into those sessions, especially the resistance training sessions, and I can guarantee that you're going to get a better return on investment, would that be a good trade-off for you? So you won't have as many of these classes. You will have more time in your day to spend towards recovery and other parasympathetic activities, and you will get a better outcome. And most of the times they tell me, well, I don't think that can happen because, that would be doing so much less. And I'm already doing as much as I can to make progress. But that's really where I turn it back on them and say, well, what if what you were doing was working, you wouldn't be unhappy with your results. So let's try a different philosophy. And oftentimes they then buy into the process and really realize that the reason that they weren't seeing strength increases or the reason they weren't seeing body composition improvements at a more expeditious rate is because they were doing too much and they weren't putting the right amount of effort, attention, and energy into the things that move the needle the most. So it really is much of a reframing. It's not about doing more, it's about doing better.
Absolutely. Okay. So, what metrics are you looking at or tracking to confirm that recomp is happening since the scale is sometimes going to be a less useful tool here?
Yeah, so there are several metrics that I use throughout this process. Now, I do want to make it clear that I do still track body weight with clients, but I treat it
Absolutely.
as like one data point. It's not the decision maker. And I don't let it be the be all end all metric of tracking progress, both for myself. And then also I make that very clear for clientele. So I very much believe in informed consent. And as we referenced on the last podcast, you have to realize that during a recomp, the scale might stay the same, it might drop slowly, or it's going to fluctuate. And that can still represent progress if fat is decreasing and muscle is increasing, because body recomposition is about improving your lean mass to fat mass ratio. It is not about what the scale is particularly doing. It's not about seeing massive scale weight losses nor scale weight gains. So instead of reacting to day-to-day changes, I'm going to look at weekly averages and longer-term trends. And I teach clients to divorce themselves from living and dying by what the scale reads on a daily basis. So this is a really good exercise essentially for them to kind of remove themselves and realize, hey, I'm seeing body composition progress, but I'm not seeing a lot of scale weight moving. Like a lot of times they're staying within a few pounds of it or at the same weight. And that really does create a better relationship, knowing that their actual scale weight isn't the best indication of their body composition progress. Now, one of the tools I use most frequently are progress photos, which I make comparisons of every single week. I pull them up on my computer. I'm doing like a visual analysis. And this is one of the most important metrics for recomposition, in my opinion, because recomposition is a visual change in body composition, not just a weight change. So during a recomposition phase, I'm looking for improved muscular definition. I'm looking for changes in shape and then tighter appearance in key areas. And often what I'll see is the person looks leaner, they look tighter, they look more defined, and they'll look more toned during the recomp process, even if the scale hasn't moved much. And the thing I like about photos is they don't lie, especially when they're consistent, they're well lit, and they're taken under the same conditions. So I give a pretty comprehensive instructions exactly how I want things done. I really like using a combination of fasted photos and then post-workout photos to be able to see their body in different states, essentially. So I want to see in a fasted state where it's more standardized. So it's to be fasted right after using the bathroom in the morning. And essentially, in a condition I like specific lighting. I usually send a ring light link to my clientele that I want them utilizing. They can have a background, whether that be a black background like I have behind me, or we can just get a neutral background. I want nothing distracting, and I want it in the same place, the same conditions, the same timing every single week. So we schedule that into their weekly schedule. And then I also get post-workout photos because I want to see them in a state where they're not, fasted. I want to see them with food, fluid, electrolytes, a pump, and really see how their body transforms throughout the day. And what I try to get across to them is your physique in a pump state or in a post-workout state is almost like a mirror into the future. Like this, your structure doesn't change completely. And that's something that our industry has been very poor at getting across. Your bones are your bones, your joint structure is your joint structure, your architecture is what it is. We can change your shape in terms of the muscle bellies and how big or small you are in terms of fat mass, losing body fat, and then increasing muscle mass. But really what you look like pumped is almost like a larger and like more defined version of yourself. So I really like using those comparisons to kind of almost look at like a trajectory and like a path forward. Now, another metric I'm going to use is going to be training performance and specifically training progression, which I find very important. So if someone is getting stronger, they're adding reps, they're increasing load, and they're improving execution, that's a strong indication that muscle is being maintained or built, especially if performance improvements are happening while body weight is stable or slightly decreasing, because performance progression is one of the leading indications of recomposition. Now, one of the most underrated indicators of recomp is how someone's clothing fits and their subjective feedback. So one thing I make most of my women do is I don't let them throw out their clothing throughout the courses of our phases together. I want them to start with their normal clothing and keep it, because what I notice with a lot of women, and I never have to say this to men, is women will go through clothing much quicker than we do. They get new outfits, they get new wardrobe, and then they don't have things to compare to. But really what I want to do is compare both their previous clothing and then also their current clothing. And oftentimes I'll have clients say things like, my clothes are fitting looser in the waist, or my glutes look fuller and they feel tighter in my jeans, or my arms look more defined in a tank. And these are real world indications and indicators of body composition change. So overall, I do want to point out that I'm never making decisions based on one metric in isolation. What I'm doing is I'm looking at a combination of their visuals, their performance, their biofeedback, our conversations, and then I'm also leveraging my experience having taken so many people through this process and helping them transform and level up their physique. So when I'm seeing performance is improving, photos are improving, and their biofeedback is good, I know that they're heading in the right direction, and we're going to keep making adjustments and modifications to ensure that they continue in this trajectory.
Okay, very well put. Final question for you then. How do we know when it's time to end a body recomp phase?
Yes, so this is going to be really heavily dependent on how much progress that person has made. Also, where their biofeedback is at. So there's many things to take into consideration from a contextual standpoint. So for instance, we have to realize that every person that we work with has a different goal set. And so a lot of times they may reach where they want it to be from a leanness perspective, but they may not have gained as much muscle mass as they wanted. So that's where the focus needs to change. Now, on the opposite side of that equation, sometimes someone won't have gotten to their goal, but we start seeing negative decrements in their biofeedback. So that could be disrupted sleep, that could be fatigue, that could be poor, just poor mood. So there's many things that we're looking at. And now we as coaches need to be able to delineate, is this a temporary or acute transient change in biofeedback, or is this something that's an indication that we need to change course? So really what I like to do is I'm seeing multiple weeks in a row, certain things are being disrupted. If someone, and now it's much easier with females than it is with males, if someone's having a disruption in their menstrual cycle, the first thing I'm doing is digging in further on that, working on certain, whether it be refeeding strategies and trying to make sure we're getting it right restored, or we're having a discussion about getting lab work and then transitioning them right out. So that's the biggest indication. That's kind of like the warning sign. But many times within a body recomp, that does not happen because we're not getting them that lean. It's not to that aggressive a degree as it would in a fat loss phase. But there's many things that would need to be taken into consideration. So I need to look at their biofeedback. I need to look at their performance. I also need to look at the trajectory of where they're at compared to where they want to be. So I will say this quite frankly, many of the women that I work with, I transition them out of a body recomposition phase, not because they're not making progress, but more so because the physique that they want requires much more muscle mass than they have. So we were able to get, first and foremost, we're able to get them immense body recomposition progress and body or physique progress in and of itself. I'm able to get them leaner and to increase lean mass a little bit more. But I've already had to kind of hit that vector of, or that lever of getting them to a slight deficit to be able to maximize that body fat loss. So I've gotten them to a leaner state so we could say, hey, their P ratio is improved. But the physique that they ultimately want, the photos that they've sent me, requires a lot more muscle mass. And that's where I have to intentionally bring them back up to maintenance or into a slight surplus to really focus on lean mass gain, because you're not going to recomp your way into a way more muscular physique. So I do want to make that clear. If you are someone that needs 10 to 15 pounds of pure lean mass to actually achieve the physique that you're looking for, it's a great starting point to start with a recomp, because we're going to get you leaner, we're going to get you more insulin sensitive, we're going to improve your metabolic health, and we're going to prime you for that building phase where you're not going to recomp your way into a drastically increased amount of muscle mass if you don't have it already.
I think that's a very important point to make as well. We kind of touched on this in the last episode as well, especially if you're that lean person who needs that more building focused recomp
Yes.
and you're wanting to approach it from, hey, I want to get leaner and build muscle the entire time. And again, we need like 15 more pounds of tissue. We're just going to need, again, like that upper end of maintenance, potentially a slight surplus and a long time there, not trying to like walk this balancing act between we're in a deficit and building muscle at the same time.
Absolutely. And I
Cool.
think that's even more important to hit on when a woman has the specific goal of building glutes. I will say this just quite frankly. A lot of times when I have women that like their main goal is glute growth, I'm going to put them into a lean building phase. That's going to be my primary area of focus, because you're not going to build your ass in a deficit. Like, quite frankly, it's a demanding muscle group, it's a large muscle group, and it is one that, if you think about the architecture of the glutes, they're made of fatty tissue. It's almost like thinking that you're going to grow your breast naturally by being in a deficit. It's not going to happen, because it's mostly fat tissue. So these are considerations that we have to make when I go through end of phase analysis and or process, like needs analysis process with a client. And their goal is they come back to me and they say, hey, I want more lean mass and I want bigger glutes and I want to get leaner. That's where I have to tell them, hey, for every give me, there's a gotcha. And we have to focus on something that's going to be more aligned with the majority of your goals. So in that case, you want more lean mass and you want bigger glutes. That is going to, the phase that's going to most appropriately get you to where you want to be is a lean building phase. And then after, we can follow it up with a fat loss phase. You're not going to be able to get both at the same time. We've recomped as far as we can go for where you were at to start with. And in this case, we need to transition out and go into a different direction to really get you to that next level.
Oh, absolutely. I would say at least anecdotally as well, like from a volume perspective, and as you said, like the total fatigue we're gonna drive, glutes, like from a volume perspective, seem to just take so much more. Like when you think about like someone's quads, like when we need to build quads or hamstrings, like
Mhm.
not anything that crazy, but glutes we need like so much more relative to that to really build. Huh. That's a really I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that, but that's a very good point. Okay, cool. As we wrap up this series, dude, again, great insights again. Been such a fun one. Anything else you want to add or leave the listener with before we close it out?
Yeah, just one thing I would like to reiterate, which I've touched on in both parts of this podcast, is that body recomposition is possible for the majority of you listening to this, but it's not going to happen by accident. You cannot expect to get a far better result than what you've achieved thus far by continuing to do what you're currently doing, or what you're comfortable doing, or what once worked for you years ago. If you want to lose body fat while building lean mass, you to achieve a dramatic physique transformation, you must be willing to dial in your diet to the next level, to push your training harder than you have before, and to raise your standard across the board. There is no staying in one place and thinking you're going to get ahead in life. You need to be willing to up the ante, to challenge yourself. And oftentimes, this is going to take getting out of your comfort zone. And this is really where coaching comes into really being a massive influence, and really something that can get you from stuck to exceptional, essentially. So this is one thing I often have conversations with, is a lot of people that I interact with, they want to continue doing what they've been doing, but they want better results. And that's just not how this game works. I wish it could be that I can keep you right in your comfort zone and get you exactly where you want to be. But by design, that would not happen. So a lot of times you have to be willing to embrace a different approach, a more dialed in approach, or it may not, you may be dialed in, but just not doing the right things. You may be putting in a ton of time, energy, attention, and effort into your fitness, into your nutrition. You're just not doing the right things because this may not be your profession, or really what it comes down to. I work with many fitness professionals. It's not that they don't have the intelligence, they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the skill sets. They do not have the objectivity to do this for themselves. So really, when it comes down to it, be willing to step outside your comfort zone. If your goal is to recomp, it is not impossible, but it is challenging and it is demanding, and it's going to require a higher version of execution and a higher version of yourself.
Very well put. And such a good way to wrap this up. As we end things here, dude, just let the listeners know where they can find you and anything at all you would like to plug.
Absolutely. So, if you guys enjoyed this two-part conversation and want to dive deeper into my approach to different physique focused goals, whether that's fat loss, or that's metabolic restoration, or it's body recomposition, you can check out my podcast, which is the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast, where I aim to bridge the gap between research and application. And I've covered literally every topic you could think of. If you're someone who wants to level up their physique and is looking for a structured, evidence-based approach, you can reach out to me directly for coaching. The best place to find me is at my email, which is DaCruzFitness@gmail.com, or you can find me for daily educational content on my Instagram, which is at @DaCruz_. And Jeremiah, as always, my man, I appreciate you having me on. I'm glad that we were able to do another masterclass. We have many series in the books, and so I hope that your audience really does benefit from this, and they're able to take a ton of takeaways and at least some good food for thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you enjoy the deeper dives, I would definitely recommend checking out Brandon's podcast. It is like a mentorship, basically. Like if you're a coach, man, you will learn just so much from listening to that. Like if you think we go deep on things here, I'm not that smart, so Brandon has to keep it kind of surface level, but you go very, very deep on your show. So you take so much from that. Can't recommend it enough. I will link all that up in the show notes. As always, dude, thank you for being here, and we will catch you
Absolutely.
guys next time.
Peace.